at 5:30 on a Thursday morning, when Flaxborough ordinarily confined itself to the more respectable varieties of unconsciousness, Father Clement Makepeace emerged from the presbytery door with a broom, a key ring, and the air of a man determined to meet God halfway on matters of church cleanliness. The cemetery, lying damp and faintly resentful behind the church, awaited his attention with the patience of an institution not short of time. Dawn had arranged itself in the orthodox manner, beginning in the east and proceeding without fuss across the low fields and allotments, pausing only to make the gravestones look marginally more sincere than usual. Father Makepeace, who believed fiercely in the spiritual value of routine so long as it was observed by other people, shuffled along the gravel path toward the new section where Mrs. Dorothea Tweed had, yesterday afternoon, been commended to eternal rest in an atmosphere of economical solemnity. He had not expected on this or any other morning to find competition for the spot. A man lay in Mrs. Tweed's grave with the careful untidiness of someone who had been arranged by committee. He was in evening dress, of a cut that suggested moderation rather than fashion, and his shoes, though muddy at the edges, retained a civic respectability which death had not yet quite discouraged. Father Makepeace looked down at him with the grave irritation of a householder discovering that some unknown caller has died on the best front mat. His first impulse was to apologize. His second, more formidable, was to find a doctrinal phrase which would permit of the situation's being nobody's fault in particular. After a brief and unsuccessful search through his mental index of pastoral responses, he crossed himself, coughed, and then, very reluctantly, went in search of the police. He did so at a brisk walk, which, had anyone been present to observe it, might have been mistaken for panic, a condition Father Makepeace regarded as theologically unsound in clergy and laity alike. No one, fortunately, was there. Inspector Purbright arrived 27 minutes later, not so much summoned as decently invited, the telephone call from the presbytery having been couched in terms appropriate to requesting the loan of a hymn book. He stepped from the police car with the circumspection of a man aware that motor vehicles were only tolerated in churchyards on sufferance, like journalists at weddings. Father Makepeace awaited him beside the open grave, hands folded, eyes carefully directed not at the body but at a point several inches above it, as though the deceased's soul were hovering there and would be less embarrassing to address. Sergeant Love, having gazed once and decided that further looking would add nothing of value, occupied himself with a notebook and the comforting formality of dates, times and spellings. "You are quite certain," Purbright asked, after a mild inspection of the stranger's shoes, "that this is not Mrs. Tweed in some revised arrangement?" Father Makepeace replied that while the church allowed for mysteries, resurrection in dress was not among them. Purbright's gaze, wandering politely over the intruder upon Mrs. Tweed's expectations, came to rest upon a folded pamphlet clenched in the right hand, with an air of posthumous determination. With the caution of a man accustomed to witnesses, he liberated it, smoothed the damp corners, and read the title, "St. Luke's Parish Newsletter, Appeal for Restoration Funds." Beneath, in smaller print, a subheading invited the Christian public to consider that the roof may be sound now, but can we say the same of our consciences? An evangelically phrased question, Purbright observed. "Do you recall distributing this particular prod to the conscience yesterday, Father?" Father Makepeace admitted that he did, that several copies had been left at the back of the church for opportunistic piety, and that anyone might have taken one without attracting more than a momentary glare from the verger. The inspector folded the paper with care and pocketed it, as though the challenge it contained might unaccountably lose strength if exposed too long to the morning air. They moved a few paces away, leaving the grave to its improper occupant, and stood beneath a yew tree which had presided over so many burials that one more, even in such circumstances, could scarcely be expected to excite it. "You buried Mrs. Tweed here yesterday," Purbright began, in the tone of a man inviting information rather than confession. Father Makepeace agreed that he had, in the presence of family, neighbors, and a weatherproof cross-section of the Mothers' Union, all of whom could vouch that a coffin had been committed with the approved degrees of solemnity and haste. The sexton, when summoned, confirmed that neither he nor the soil had been disturbed during the night, his pride in the tidiness of his handiwork only slightly mitigated by the present complication. It appeared, therefore, that Mrs. Tweed had not merely yielded her accommodation to a stranger, but had removed herself so completely that no one could say where, or indeed whether, she now was. Purbright regarded the grave and altered plans, By the time Inspector Purbright had returned to the police station and written his first report in the neutral, faintly apologetic prose preferred by his superiors, St. Jude's Finance and Restoration Committee had convened what Mrs. Cynthia Blundell chose to describe as a brief, clarifying discussion. In practice, this meant an emergency meeting at 11 o'clock, timed with careful malice to coincide with the town's ordinary working hours when honest employment might otherwise have claimed its members. The church hall's committee room, which had once served as a Sunday school, retained the atmosphere of reluctant moral instruction. Its walls offered faded posters concerning missionary efforts in distant countries, lovingly ignored for the past decade. The long table bore the scars of many previous struggles for procedural advantage, its surface worn in those places habitually thumped by indignant chairmen. Someone had provided a plate of biscuits, thereby suggesting that Christian charity might yet be sustained by glucose. Mrs. Blundell sat at the head of the table in a posture that combined martyrdom and authority in proportions gratifying to herself. She was a woman of those indeterminate years which suggested that time, when confronted with a strong personality, might sensibly retreat. Her hat alone, a flowered structure of ambitious circumference, appeared to occupy a minor parish of its own. She arranged her papers, fixed a look of benevolent severity upon her colleagues, and rang a small bell whose origin was lost in parish folklore. "I think," she began, "we are all aware of the unfortunate incident in the churchyard this morning. There was a general rustling of bodies into attitudes of concern. No one asked for clarification. Ignorance would have been interpreted as negligence, and negligence, in the context of church matters, was indistinguishable from atheism." Mr. Septimus Cringe, the treasurer, adjusted his spectacles with the cautious movements of a man accustomed to small but significant errors in addition. His thin face, elongated by worry and unacknowledged indigestion, suggested someone permanently surprised by the cost of things. On either side of him sat Miss Wentell, the recording secretary, and Mr. Pottle, who attended in his capacity as sexto and representative of the lower orders. "The police," Mrs. Blundell continued, pronouncing the word as though referring to a disagreeable but necessary sanitary service, "have been informed. Inspector Purbright has, I understand, taken the matter in hand. Our task this morning is a modest one, to ensure that the Church, as an institution, cannot reasonably be regarded as responsible for administrative confusion." Mr. Cringe coughed. It was not a particularly loud cough, but in that room it achieved the moral resonance of an interruption. "You have something to add, Septimus?" she asked, with a politeness that anticipated regret. "I merely wondered, Madam Chair," Cringe replied, "whether we are entirely clear as to the nature of the confusion in question. I have heard various accounts. It would be helpful to know precisely what is being clarified in my absence from the vestry." Miss Wentell consulted her shorthand notebook with a diligence whose main object was to avoid meeting anyone's eye. "There appears to have been a body," she said eventually, "where there should not have been one." "That is a distressingly literal summary," Mrs. Blundell observed. "A gentleman not associated with our congregation was found occupying the grave prepared for the late Mrs. Tweed Pottle, whose duties required a passing acquaintance with mortality, shifted in his chair. Begging your pardon, ma'am, but Mrs. Tweed's grave was not, in a strict sense, occupied. That is to say, the coffin in question—" Yes, we are aware of the regrettable technicalities," Mrs. Blundell interrupted. "The point is that a stranger has chosen to make his final appearance in connection with St. Jude's. This is unfortunate from every possible angle." "Not entirely every angle," murmured Mr. Cringe, with the air of a man unable to resist an accounting metaphor. "It does at least demonstrate that the grave was correctly prepared and attractively situated." The remark failed to earn even the courtesy of a smile. Mrs. Blundell regarded him as one might a junior clerk who had misplaced a vital ledger. "The deceased," she said, "has been identified as Mr. Lionel Catchpole." Cringe's fingers twitched on the table surface. In a less pious atmosphere, the movement might have been likened to a flinch. "Catchpole," he repeated. "Indeed, a familiar name. Familiar to you, Septimus?" Her tone was mild, which made it dangerous. Cringe folded his hands as if in prayer. Merely in a professional sense. Mr. Catchpole had made certain inquiries of a financial character. He conveyed an interest in our restoration fund. "And you did not think it necessary to inform the committee of this attention?" "It seemed premature," Cringe said. "Gentlemen of Mr. Catchpole's background occasionally find fault on principle. It is their livelihood. I preferred, in the first instance, to reassure him privately." Did you succeed? Miss Wentle asked, surprising herself as much as anyone. Cringe considered. I fear not entirely. He requested sight of our ledgers. I was, of course, preparing them for that purpose. Preparing, Mrs. Blundell repeated. One had imagined our accounts already existed. Certainly, certainly, Cringe said quickly, but the presentation of figures requires sensitivity. Raw numbers can be misinterpreted by those unfamiliar with church practice. Pottle, whose acquaintance with finance extended to the contents of his wage envelope, allowed himself the luxury of a silent thought. It concerned the convenience of misinterpretation to those who produced the numbers in the first place. Mr. Catchpole, Mrs. Blundell continued, did he give any indication of his attitude? He was not, I regret to say, entirely sympathetic, Cringe replied. He referred to discrepancies. I explained that in parish affairs, certain expenditures resist conventional classification. The price of Christian work cannot always be itemized. Yet Mr. Catchpole persisted, Miss Wentle noted. Yes, he mentioned, somewhat injudiciously, that he might feel constrained to communicate with higher ecclesiastical authority. I took this to mean the bishop. I observed that the bishop possessed many responsibilities, and that burdening him with arithmetic might not prove spiritually productive. Mr. Catchpole remained unconvinced. There followed a small silence, during which the committee contemplated the inconveniences of higher authority when applied to their own affairs. Bishops were excellent on ceremonial occasions, but lamentably literal about sums of money. Then Mrs. Blundell said, we must accept that Mr. Catchpole's presence in Mrs. Tweed's grave will excite speculation regarding our accounts. Unjustly, Cringe said quickly. Perhaps, she replied. Yet injustice is no guarantee against gossip. We must be prepared for inquiries, official or otherwise. Pottle looked uneasy. Begging your pardon again, ma'am, but Inspector Purbright, he did ask about the newsletters, particularly the last one with the appeal. Perfectly natural, Mrs. Blundell said. He would wish to establish that the deceased had some civilized reading material. It would be far worse if he had been found clutching a racing paper. He had the page folded at your report, ma'am, Pottle persisted. The one about the restoration totals. Miss Wentle, sensing a momentary shift in the draft of conversation, glanced up. The totals, as published, she said cautiously. They were supplied by Mr. Cringe. All figures were accurate in principle, Cringe replied. Some pledges have yet to be honored, that is all. In financial statements, it is sometimes necessary to anticipate. Hope, after all, is a Christian virtue. Hope, said Mrs. Blundell, is best confined to sermons. On balance sheets it becomes misleading. The remark hung in the air with unacknowledged implications. No one, least of all the treasurer, chose to examine them closely. I propose, she continued, in a brisker tone, that we adopt certain measures. First, we shall cooperate fully with Inspector Purbright, within the limits of discretion appropriate to church business. Secondly, we shall ensure that our records, past, present, and projected, are placed in such order that no outsider might reasonably misinterpret them. Thirdly, we should perhaps prepare a brief statement for the parish, couched in reassuring terms. A circular, suggested Miss Wentle. I could draft something for the newsletter. A short note, perhaps, emphasizing our transparency. No, Mrs. Blundell said firmly. Transparency is not a word to be used in connection with any matter still under police examination. We shall emphasize continuity, gratitude, and the tragic loss of a man who, however irregular his final appearance, must be assumed to have harbored charitable intentions. Cringe allowed himself a breath he had not been aware of holding. The ground beneath his moral feet remained unsteady, but it had not yet opened. One further question, Mrs. Blundell said, gathering her papers. These approaches from Mr. Catchpole. Have you retained his letters, Septimus? Naturally, he replied. All correspondence relating to parish finances is carefully filed. Then perhaps, she said, regarding him with a politeness now entirely administrative, you would be good enough to bring them to my house this afternoon. I should like to familiarize myself with the exact nature of his concerns. Cringe hesitated minutely. I shall locate them, he said. There may be some small delay. My filing system, though comprehensive, is no. T always immediately navigable. Miss Wentle, who had once seen the treasurer's study and its geological strata of paper, accepted this without difficulty. Mrs. Blundell, whose imagination did not extend to domestic disorder in others, merely nodded. The meeting dissolved with that particular air of relief which follows any gathering that has successfully failed to reach conclusions. Coats were claimed, chairs pushed back, and the plate of biscuits diminished under the pressure of residual unease. One by one they departed into the quietly watchful streets of Flaxborough, each carrying away a private version of the morning's events. Pottle lingered to stack the chairs. In so doing he noticed, beneath the treasurer's vacated place, a folded sheet that had drifted to the floor. It bore rows of figures in Mr. Cringe's small, anxious hand, and at the top, underlined twice, the name Catchpole. Pottle replaced the paper exactly where he had found it, on the empty chair, and went about his work without comment. It struck him, however, that for a man devoted to orderly accounts, Mr. Cringe appeared curiously careless about what he left behind. The Cringe residence occupied a narrow plot in one of Flaxborough's more aspirational streets, where respectability was measured chiefly by the persistence of lace curtains and the number of times the hall runner had been turned. The house itself, a thin, upright construction of grudging brick, seemed to be standing on tiptoe in an effort to appear taller than its neighbours. Its windows, polished to a high moral sheen, regarded the street with the anxious vigilance of a nervous aunt. Inspector Purbright arrived in the late afternoon when the light had assumed that pale, impartial quality which flatters neither complexion nor conscience. Mr. Septimus Cringe opened the door personally, as if unwilling to permit any member of his house. He holds staff, real or hypothetical, to witness the arrival of the police. He wore a cardigan of uncertain persuasion and an expression that had clearly rehearsed denial, but not quite perfected it. "Inspector," he said, with the elaborate neutrality of a man determined to be neither cordial nor obstructive, "you find me in the midst of certain reconciliations, of the financial variety." "Then I am fortunate," Purbright replied mildly. "It is always easier to discuss figures when they are already on the table." Mr. Cringe's sitting room had the air of a place whose occupant had long ago surrendered to the tyranny of paper. Ledgers, file binders, and foolscap accumulated in cautious drifts on every available surface. Each stack was arranged with defensive precision, as if the documents themselves might be questioned and would require instant access to supporting material. "You will forgive the disorder," Cringe murmured, gesturing toward a chair that had been cleared with the reluctant haste of an emergency amputation. "I am engaged in preparing material for the diocesan auditors, a tedious if necessary operation." Purbright sat carefully, aware that any sudden movement might trigger an avalanche of vouchers. "I understand the timing of the auditor's visit is somewhat awkward." Cringe's mouth twitched. "In the temporal sense, certainly. Spiritually speaking, I have long anticipated some form of reckoning." From the mantelpiece, a sepia photograph of a thin woman looked down with the uncomplaining fortitude of those whose chief domestic occupation has been making the best of things. Mrs. Cringe, now several years departed, had been widely reputed to possess a gift for thrift bordering on pathology. The house still bore evidence of her policies in the form of antimacassars and curtains, whose patterns had been fashionable during one of the more regrettable decades of the pre-Vias century. "You should understand, Inspector," Cringe began, folding his hands with conscious care, "that parish finances are an intricate organism. Funds must be moved at times, from one account to another, to prevent stagnation. It is not misappropriation, it is circulation. An admirable principle," Purbright agreed. "Mr. Catchpole, I gather, took a less generous view of these circulations." The treasurer's lips compressed into a narrow defensive line. Mr. Catchpole was afflicted with a banking mentality. He regarded every transaction as either innocent or criminal, with no allowance for pastoral subtlety. "Church affairs require greater elasticity." "He summoned you for a meeting," Purbright said. "The evening before his death." Cringe hesitated. His gaze drifted toward a ledger on the sideboard, then retreated. "We spoke only briefly." He had drawn up what he described as a schedule of irregularities, a most unfortunate choice of phrase. I explained the context of each item, but he appeared unreconciled, and yet he left Flaxborough in the early hours and somehow contrived to arrive in Mrs. Tweed's grave, Purbright remarked. "An itinerary that suggests unfinished business." Cringe licked his lips. "If you are implying, Inspector, that I possess any knowledge of how he came to be in that absurd position, I must correct you. I last saw Mr. Catchpole alive at 9:10, when he departed my house in what I took to be righteous indignation. I have not the remotest idea how he spent the remainder of his evening." Purbright did not dispute this. He looked instead at the ledger on the writing table, whose open pages displayed columns of figures written in a hand of admirable clarity. "May I?" he asked. Reluctance flickered, then retreated under the pressure of propriety. They are, in essence, working notes, Cringe said. Naturally, they lack the P.O. lish of my official statements. The inspector bent over the book. The headings were precise, the arithmetic unassailable. What drew his attention was not the totals, but the annotations in the margins. Several entries bore initials, CB, SC, DT. Others were marked with small tight circles like discrete halos. You employ a system of reference? Purbright asked. Merely a mnemonic. These initials represent particular donors or committees responsible for certain transfers. One must keep track, and the circles? Cringe drew himself up. Items subject to clarification. It would be irresponsible to present incomplete documentation to the diocese. Purbright's finger rested lightly on an entry labeled Restoration Fund, Consultancy Disbursement. The amount was modest but repeated at intervals. Mr. Catchpole believed these were irregular, I understand, because he failed to appreciate that expertise must be remunerated. Cringe answered, too quickly. The parish sought advice on planning regulations, structural assessments, insurance provisions. These matters do not arrange themselves. Who precisely supplied this expertise? Cringe adjusted his spectacles again, though they required no adjustment. Various persons, some local, some not. It is remarkable, Inspector, how many people are prepared to devote their time to spiritual architecture when properly encouraged. Encouragement being the consultancy payments. He received no reply, only a small fatigued sigh. Purbright closed the ledger gently. Mr. Catchpole left papers, he said. He had compiled his own schedule. It does not coincide with yours. It would not, Cringe replied. He examined numbers without context. Figures are like parishioners, Inspector. Viewed collectively, they present a pleasing picture. Studied individually, they can be most trying. The dry remark might, at another time, have amused Purbright. Now it merely settled between them like an unwelcome truth. There was a sound in the passage, the faint clink of crockery handled with more care than was necessary. A door opened a little, then closed again. Cringe glanced toward it with guilty irritation. My niece, he said. She keeps house for me, anxious creature. Believes the police bring disgrace, no matter how innocent the occasion. Her concern is not unique, Purbright murmured. Flaxborough holds an ecumenical view of scandal. Cringe did not smile. Mr. Cringe, the inspector continued, Mr. Catchpole wrote to the bishop. A draft was found among his effects. He intended to send it once he had completed his examination. Did he mention that to you? A pulse jumped faintly in the treasurer's temple. He made certain threats. I regarded them as rhetorical. Yet you began these reconciliations immediately afterwards, Purbright said, preparing for the diocesan auditors with unusual diligence. I am a conscientious man, Cringe replied stiffly. If I have erred, it has been on the side of zeal. The crockery in the passage made another discreet suggestion of movement. Purbright rose. I shall not keep you from your labors then. The bishop's men will no doubt appreciate the effort. Cringe accompanied him to the door with the resigned courtesy of someone seeing off an auditor rather than a policeman. At the threshold, however, Purbright paused. One small point, he said. At the committee meeting yesterday, you left behind a sheet of figures. Rather unusual for a man so careful. Color rose slowly along the treasurer's neck. An oversight, he said. Even the most meticulous are occasionally distracted. Of course, Purbright agreed. What interested me was the notation at the top. Mr. Catchpole's name double underlined. It was merely a reference. For cross-checking, naturally. Purbright stepped out onto the path, then turned back. When the diocesan auditor arrives, will he find your ledgers in the same condition as Mr. Catchpole did? For a moment, Mr. Cringe's careful composure faltered. The auditor, he said, will find them in a condition appropriate to ecclesiastical review, which, Purbright reflected as he walked back to his car, was an answer that managed to satisfy nobody while admitting nothing. At an upstairs window, a pale, narrow face watched him leave, the anxious niece, fingers pressed against the glass, as though testing the strength of the barrier between private account-keeping and public consequence. Behind her, on a small table, lay an envelope addressed in a different hand, a firmer, tighter script, bearing in the corner the name of a bank and on its flap, a faint brown smudge where something or someone had once rested an unsteady thumb. By long tradition, the duties of sexton at St. Jude's were entrusted to a man of proven discretion, modest appetite, and selective deafness. Jeremiah Pottle satisfied these requirements so thoroughly that the parish, having once appointed him, appeared to forget the possibility of alternatives. His small cottage leaned against the churchyard wall in a posture of permanent apology, exuding a smell compounded of damp cassocks, chrysanthemums past their best, and the more resigned varieties of disinfectant. The path from the vestry door to his own had been worn smooth by respectable footwear, most of it attempting with varying success to look as though it had other destinations in mind. Inspector Purbright chose the path openly. He considered that a man employed to observe parish comings and goings would feel insulted by any effort to sneak among them. Pottle opened the cottage door at the second knock, wiping his hands on a rag which gave the impression of having once been a curter. In more prosperous surroundings, his lean face managed in a single expression to convey welcome for the inspector and mild distaste for the circumstances that made such visits necessary. "Afternoon, sir," he said. "You'll be wanting the church, or what's turned up in it." "In this instance," Purbright replied, "I am more interested in what has turned up immediately adjacent to it." Pottle stepped back, allowing the inspector into a room arranged with the regimented tidiness common to men who have learned that their possessions must be few if they are to be kept under proper supervision. A kettle sang with unconvincing cheerfulness on a gas ring. From one wall, a calendar featuring a view of the Holy Land offered implausible sunlight to the scene. "I'll make tea," the sexton said, with the air of someone admitting to a moral weakness. "Men don't talk proper without something hot in their hands. 'Less it's a pint, and that's for lying." Purbright accepted this philosophy in silence and watched Pottle's economical movements. The man set out 2 cups, both in the same chipped pattern. "Equal treatment," the inspector noted, extended to crockery. "You found Mr. Catchpole yesterday morning," Purbright began when they were seated. "I'm interested in what you observed both then and in the days before." Pottle wrapped his fingers around his cup, as though the heat assisted recollection. "Didn't so much find him as inherit him, sir," he said. "Father Makepeace, he's the one as had the first look. I came along after when there was talk of police and such. Grave wasn't ready proper till this morning, you see. Men from the corporation won't work overtime now without a contract and a written apology." "And before that?" Purbright prompted. Pottle's gaze drifted toward the curtained window, behind which the lichen-covered headstones conducted their long campaign against legibility. "Night afore I saw him," he said. "Mr. Catchpole, that is. 'Bout 10:30, maybe a bit more. I was locking up after choir practice. They've took to rehearse sing evenings, so's people can quarrel in the dark where it don't show." "Where was Mr. Catchpole?" "In the passage by the vestry," Pottle replied. "Not casual-like either. Had his hand on the accounts office door. That's the little room off the vestry where Mr. Cringe keeps the church books. He had a key." Purbright raised an eyebrow almost imperceptibly. "You are certain it was a key and not, say, some improvised instrument?" "Church keys don't improvise, sir," Pottle said mildly. "They're too proud. This one was one of ours. Long shaft, bit like a question mark, what's give up trying. He opened the door as if he'd done it before." "And you challenged him?" "I coughed," Pottle said, with professional nuance. "Man doesn't like to be startled when he's doing something he might prefer not to have witnessed. Gives them an excuse to act injured. A cough gives them a choice. And which did he choose?" He turned and said, most polite, "Evening, Mr. Pottle. Father Makepeace gave me permission to look at some figures. Church business, I dare say you're familiar with that condition." "Did Father Makepeace give him such permission?" Purbright asked. Pottle shrugged, a small, self-effacing movement. "Didn't seem to me the sort of thing the father would say. He's more likely to put off figures till next quarter, same as confessions. But it weren't my job to argue with a gentleman in a dinner jacket who spoke like he owned an adding machine." "How long did he remain in the office?" "Couldn't say exactly. I went about my bits, locking, checking candles, that sort of thing. When I come back 20 minutes later, he were gone, door locked, everything quiet as a collection plate on a Wednesday." Purbright considered this. In silence. The little room off the vestry, Mrs. Blundell had described it with faint contempt as Mr. Cringe's lair. An unathletic gentleman in evening dress, inspecting ledgers after hours with an official key, the night before he appeared in a grave with a parish newsletter clutched in his hand. This arrangement suggested a coherence that reality in Flaxborough rarely achieved without help. "Did you notice anything unusual about the office?" the inspector asked. "Lights, sounds, movements that did not belong?" "Only that it was occupied," Pottle replied. "Place is mostly empty, unless Mr. Cringe is in there explaining something to his conscience. The window was steamed up a bit when I come by. That told me he'd been at it properly. Men don't steam windows for nothing." He sipped his tea with the air of having contributed a significant forensic point. "You found the grave open at dawn?" Purbright resumed. Ground was cut as I left it, Pottle said. Corporation men dug, I tidy. I got there soon after 5. Man likes to get the dead comfortable before the live ones start asking questions. Only this time the dead had beaten me to it. You had not, then, left the grave in a state suitable for occupation? Pottle allowed himself the briefest suspicion of a smile. Unless there's a new fashion for clay pillows, no, sir. Whoever put him there did it after the men finished and before I come back. And they were tidy. No spillage. You don't often get tidiness with midnight visitors. Purbright noted the word whoever without comment. Pottle's mind, it seemed, did not trouble itself with suggestions of spontaneous burial. In your opinion, the inspector asked, would it have been possible to bring a body into the churchyard during the night without attracting notice? If a man knows the times, Pottle said. There's a goods train at past, shakes the stones. 2, Tom. From the brewery argue behind the Red Lion until gone 11. After that, you've just the cats and what they're regretting. A quiet party could manage if he knew where not to step. You did not hear anything unusual? I heard what I always hear, Inspector. Things I can't explain and things I don't get paid extra to investigate. There was no resentment in his tone, merely a statement of professional boundaries. Purbright rose, setting his empty cup down with a deferential clink. You have been helpful, Mr. Pottle. Not sure I have, the sexton replied, but I dare say I will be if matters carry on. They usually do. Dead folk don't like being where they weren't meant. As Purbright reached the door, Pottle cleared his throat. There is one other thing, he said, in the manner of someone mentioning a minor leak in a dam. When I found Mr. Catchpole this morning, Father Makepeace beside him, you remember, the Reverend was holding a key, long church key, same sort as I saw the gentleman using last night. Perhaps his own, Purbright suggested. Perhaps, Pottle agreed. Only Father's keys jangle. There were no others on the ring, just the one. Looked new, if you take my meaning. The inspector stepped back onto the worn path. The church bulked solid and silent against a sky the color of diluted ink. Behind him, in the little cottage pressed to the wall of consecrated ground, Jeremiah Pottle quietly rehung his own heavy ring of iron keys. For the first time in many years he counted them. Miss Agatha Prim's cottage stood at the far end of a lane that appeared to have been forgotten by the borough surveyor at some indeterminate point between 2 wars, and never properly rediscovered. The hedge, having received no formal guidance for several seasons, expressed itself freely over the path. Inspector Purbright regarded the modest facade with the mild curiosity he reserved. For properties belonging to women who appeared at first glance to have nothing to conceal, the key, provided by a neighbor with regretful willingness, turned smoothly. Inside, the air bore the faint but determined odor of lavender furniture polish and boiled cabbage, a domestic combination traditionally associated with modest respectability and limited imagination. The small sitting room presented an arrangement of furniture that suggested not creativity but obedience to a page from a shop catalogue 20 years out of date. Miss Prim's personality, to the extent that she had permitted one, revealed itself in paper rather than ornament. There were very few photographs and no sentimental bric-a-brac. Instead, the writing table beneath the front window had assumed the role of domestic shrine. Pens were aligned by size, envelopes stacked with military precision, and a blotter lay at the exact center, as though any deviation might invite theological censure. Purbright approached the table with the careful neutrality of a man entering a confessional not his own. It required no particular investigative genius to locate the drawer that mattered. An accumulation of letters, bound with the undemonstrative practicality of string rather than ribbon, rested atop bank statements clipped in chronological batches. A small envelope, addressed to Miss Prim, private, lacked a stamp and postmark. It had clearly not been entrusted to the postal service. He began with the letters bearing Mrs. Dorothea Tweed's familiar wavering hand. The earliest, dated nearly 2 years before her death, dealt with harmless logistics, arrangements for dental appointments, prescriptions, and the vexed question of which niece deserved the family silver, without occasioning vulgar competition. The tone was brisk, occasionally waspish, but essentially undisrupted by moral upheaval, the later let. As, however, displayed a change in both content and direction. One, written 6 months earlier, opened without preamble, Agatha, I have been examining the accounts of the so-called Restoration Fund. If these figures are to be believed, and I confess myself unwilling to extend them courtesy, our roof has been repaired at least 3 times, our stonework repointed twice, and our organ regilded to a condition that would shame Westminster Abbey. As nothing of the sort has occurred, I am driven to the uncomfortable suspicion that piety is being employed as a cover for arithmetic of a rather imaginative order. Purbright allowed himself a small private smile. The language had about it the bracing odor of scandal discovered late in life, a tonic more invigorating than any prescribed by doctors. A subsequent letter, its ink blotted where Mrs. Tweed's hand had evidently betrayed her, continued the theme. The treasurer persists in describing certain items as administrative contingencies. When pressed, he becomes almost lyrical on the subject of diocesan procedure. I am too old to be placated by adjectives. I intend to ask for invoices, not assurances. Cynthia will be displeased. She has that look one sees on committee women when someone suggests that minutes should reflect what was actually said. There followed a series of notes documenting, with methodical irritation, each attempt to extract clarity from the committee. Mrs. Tweed had taken to sharing these efforts with Miss Prim, who, according to the priest's housekeeper, had shown a livelier interest in parish finances than in scripture. One letter in particular caught Purbright's attention. It was addressed not to Miss Prim, but to Mr. Lionel Catchpole and bore no stamp. The envelope had been sealed, then opened carefully with a knife. The contents retained the formal stiffness of a first approach. Dear Sir, Miss Prim has informed me that you possess experience in the examination of financial arrangements, particularly those that thrive under the guise of public virtue. I enclose copies of the most recent statements regarding St. Jude's Restoration Fund. I should value your professional opinion as to whether my suspicions rest upon substance or merely upon an irritable old woman's loss of patience with ecclesiastical imprecision. The letter remained unsigned, though the handwriting was unmistakably Mrs. Tweed's. A penciled note in a different hand, neat, unshaking, and distinctly un-Tweed-like, appeared at the bottom, not sent. AP to speak to him instead. Purbright folded the sheet thoughtfully. Miss Prim, it appeared, had already begun to act as an intermediary between her employer and the bank examiner, choosing oral communication where the older woman had preferred written record. Such decisions rarely improved clarity, but frequently enhanced deniability. Another document, dated the week before Mrs. Tweed's death, was of a less comfortable nature. It was clearly a draft, amended in 2 inks and several moods, to the chair and members of the Finance Committee. At our next meeting, I shall require an explanation of the continuing divergence between the advertised objectives of the Restoration Fund and the observable condition of the church fabric. In particular, I wish to know why certain professional fees appear repeatedly attached to no named professional, and why Mr. Cringe becomes so remarkably inarticulate when invited to identify them. I am not yet accusing anyone of dishonesty. I am simply declining to assume virtue without evidence, a habit I abandoned with adolescence. In the margin, in the same firm, alien hand that had annotated the Catchpole letter, someone had written, "Too sharp, suggest soften. C may react badly." The C could have been Cynthia or Cringe, both. Purbright reflected, were known to react badly to many things, including scrutiny. It was the small notebook at the back of the drawer, almost concealed beneath a stack of household bills, that offered the most candid glimpse. This clearly belonged to Miss Prim. The entries were brief, economical, and devoid of flourish, as though she had found extravagance of any kind, linguistic or financial, offensive. 28th March. D again upset about fund. Says she feels made a fool of. CB very sweet on telephone. Promises clarification in due course. D not reassured. Says people who promise clarity usually intend delay. 10th April. D speaks of changing will. Wants to leave final legacy specifically to genuine repair, not committee luncheons. Suggests consulting solicitor in town. Must be careful. CB will not like that. A later entry had been circled. 18th May. Supper with D and CB here. Atmosphere brittle. D mentions invoices again. CB smiles too much. After she leaves, D says, "If they have been dipping their fingers in God's till, they will not enjoy my next contribution." She laughs, but not entirely kindly. The final pages grew more compressed, as though events had accelerated and Miss Prim's hand struggled to keep pace. 23rd June. D insists on seeing Catchpole. Gives me copies of accounts to pass to him. Says she wants independent verification before the bishop hears. D also very insistent about funeral arrangements, wants burial beside late husband, no committee interference. 25th June, D worse this evening. Talk again of changing will. CB calls unexpectedly, long private conversation in sitting room. After she goes, D. Quiet says, feeling very tired of everyone. The last entry bore yesterday's date, written in ink that had blotted in one corner, funeral tomorrow. D. spoke this morning about final gesture refund if certain matters no. T. resolved. Mentioned letter to Bishop. Could cause unpleasantness but situation probably requires it. Note to self, retrieve her drafts from desk before they fall into wrong hands. Purbright read the line again, tracing the calm practicality of it. The phrase before they fall into wrong hands possessed, in the circumstances, a particular resonance. It implied that Miss Prim considered herself a custodian not merely of Mrs. Tweed's comfort, but of her posthumous discretion. He replaced the notebook and letters with careful exactness, disturbed nothing that might offend some later, more official inventory. In the small kitchen he found evidence of a hasty departure, a teacup unwashed, a loaf left uncovered, and a calendar still showing yesterday, despite Miss Prim's apparent determination to be safely elsewhere today. She had left no forwarding address, only the competent emptiness of rooms tidied just enough to suggest a temporary absence, rather than desertion. As he stepped back into the lane, Purbright considered the curious conjunction of events, a companion who removed incriminating drafts for safekeeping, a benefactress whose doubts had become too well informed for comfort, and a bank examiner who had died conveniently soon after promising to correct his earlier accusations. The hedge rustled faintly in the faint wind, offering no opinion. But the inspector found himself wondering, with increasing persistence, whether Miss Prim's loyalty had extended to protecting Mrs. Tweed's reputation, or merely to managing, with quiet efficiency, the untidier consequences of her inquiries. The premises of Wrench & Sons, funeral directors, occupied a corner site near the railway bridge, where the town began slowly to remember the existence of fields. The building combined shopfront gloom with a certain reluctant respectability, as though anxious to reassure passers-by. Death, while unfortunate, was at least being handled by experienced tradesmen. A display of discreet brass urns in the window spoke of practical piety, while a small notice proclaimed, "Estimates carefully prepared." It did not specify for whom. Inspector Purbright was shown into the arrangement room, where Grief was invited to sit on horsehair chairs and consider menu-style options for farewell. The walls were panelled in dark wood that had given up hope of ever being cheerful. Mr. Adolphus Wrench entered moments later, smoothing his black waistcoat with the air of a man perpetually expecting to be blamed for the weather. "Inspector," he said, bowing fractionally, "a melancholy pleasure. I trust there is no immediate requirement?" "Not for myself," Purbright replied. "I wish to discuss the late Mrs. Dorothea Tweed, and by extension certain matters of professional flexibility." Wrench's eyelids flickered. Undertakers, like bank managers, disliked the idea that their flexibility might be visible to anyone but themselves. He gestured to a chair and took his own place behind a polished desk whose surface bore only a blotter, a silver-plated pen, and the accumulated weight of unspoken arrangements. Mrs. Tweed's funeral, he began cautiously, was conducted in full accordance with the family's wishes. Floral tributes, motor hearse, no limousines, as Miss Prim felt that ostentation in mourning betokened insecurity in affection. "We supplied the standard oak coffin, brass furnishings, lining to diocesan specifications, and you supplied," Purbright interrupted mildly, "a coffin occupied not by the deceased lady, but by a quantity of sandbags." Mr. Wrench's professional composure altered by about a quarter of an inch. "You have, I see, been comprehensively informed. The sexton is a devoted archivist of practical detail," Purbright said. "The question that concern is how you came to be so accommodating. Sandbags are an unusual client request." Wrench folded his hands on the blotter, as though preparing to preside over a meeting of reluctant shareholders. "Miss Prim called upon me the evening before the funeral," he said. "She brought a letter, purportedly from Mrs. Tweed, expressing a late preference for cremation. A not uncommon development, Inspector. People are so easily influenced by articles in magazines. And you accepted this alteration without consultation with the parish?" There was no time. The grave had already been prepared. To cancel the service would have created embarrassment. Wrench pronounced the word with the emphasis due to a genuine catastrophe. Miss Prim was most insistent that appearances be maintained. She suggested, indeed she proposed with some clarity, that we conduct a ceremonial burial in every visible respect, while in practice arranging for immediate cremation, a funeral of form rather than content, Purbright observed. "And you agreed?" Wrench hesitated. Professional ethics, like black crepe, could be draped to cover almost anything. Miss Prim produced the necessary fees in cash, he said at last. In my trade, Inspector, sensitivity to the wishes of the family is considered paramount. One sometimes finds that theological niceties are more flexibly interpreted by the living than by the dead. Quite, Purbright said. And Mrs. Tweed herself, where was she physically at the time of the funeral? In our chapel of rest, Wrench replied, recovering some composure in the face of a clear factual question. We conveyed the coffin, containing the deceased, to the municipal crematorium at 8 o'clock the following morning. I have here. He opened a drawer with ceremonial care, the official certificate of cremation signed by the medical referee. He placed the document on the desk as one might present a trump card at whist. Purbright read it through without comment. And the ashes? Delivered to Miss Prim's address yesterday afternoon. She signed the receipt herself, requested a plain bronze urn. Nothing sentimental, she said. One gains an impression in that line of work of those who intend to keep their bereavement private and those who anticipate visitors. Purbright replaced the certificate. You appreciated, of course, that substituting sand for a body in a consecrated grave might be regarded as irregular. Wrench's lips tightened. Inspector, I sell coffins, not metaphysics. The vicar conducted the service over what he understood to be the remains of Mrs. Tweed. The mourners derived such comfort as they were able. The earth received something weighty. From an operational standpoint, the essential requirements were met. Except that the grave, Purbright said, subsequently acquired a second, rather more unexpected occupant. Yes, Wrench admitted faintly. I read the report in the Gazette. One prefers not to see one's professional premises associated with surplus corpses. Purbright allowed the silence to lengthen. Wrench, like many who live by tact, found silence intolerably explicit. If I may speak with professional candor, the undertaker resumed, my chief concern at the time was Miss Prim's urgency. She was most eager that the cremation should be completed before any member of the parish committee thought to inquire about altered arrangements. She appeared particularly anxious that Mrs. Blundell should not be troubled. Considerate of her, Purbright murmured. Did she explain this tenderness? She remarked. Wrench said slowly that Mrs. Tweed's little inquiries had made her unpopular in certain quarters. She hinted that some members of the committee might find it a relief to have the dear lady peacefully out of the way. Her phrase, not mine. A spiritual relief, presumably, Purbright said. One must assume so, Inspector. In my experience, people are most devout when the subject turns to money. Purbright rose, letting his hand rest for a moment on the cremation certificate. You will understand that I must take this with me, of course. Wrench watched it depart with the expression of a man seeing a valuable guarantee disappear into someone else's pocket. May I ask, Inspector, purely as an interested layman, does this complication alter Mrs. Tweed's position? In one sense, Purbright said, her position is now perfectly clear. In another, it has become substantially more awkward for everyone else. As they returned toward the front of the premises, the inspector's attention was caught by a narrow shelf behind the reception counter, partly obscured by an artificial wreath. It contained 3 labeled cardboard trays of index cards, arranged by year. Wrench noticed his glance. Record of clients, he said, for administrative purposes. The Borough Council is particular about such things. Purbright's eyes moved along the labels. 1968 to 1972, 1,973 to 1,977, 1978, and then a 4th tray, pushed slightly back, bearing no visible label at all. It appeared modestly anonymous in comparison with its predecessors. An overflow, he asked. Wrench looked, and for the briefest moment allowed irritation to surface. Staff error, Inspector. My assistant finds alphabetical order a challenge. It will be corrected. Purbright merely nodded, yet as he stepped back into the pale afternoon, he retained a precise image of that unlabeled tray, its edges dustier than the rest. In an establishment devoted to recording the exact particulars of the departed, anonymity rarely occurred by accident. Lionel Catchpole had chosen to lodge in that portion of Flaxborough which, while not precisely select, was at least particular. The houses in Albany Terrace stood in a row of Victorian correctness, their identical facades suggesting unanimity on all important questions, such as curtain fabric and the undesirability of loud voices. Number 6 distinguished itself only by a brass plate declaring furnished rooms, quiet gentlefolk. a notice that appeared at once an aspiration and a warning. Mrs. Vining, the proprietress, received Inspector Purbright in her narrow hall with an air of professionally controlled distress. She was a woman whose figure suggested economies practiced in all departments except those of starch and opinion. "I do hope, Inspector," she began, in a whisper loud enough to qualify as confidential in Flaxborough, "that Mr. Catchpole has not been involved in anything improper. My establishment has never yet been mentioned in the newspapers." "I understand your concern," Purbright replied. "We shall endeavour to preserve both your reputation and his, so far as the facts permit. May we see his room?" She led the way upstairs with the slow dignity of one conducting a reluctant delegation to committee. The landing smelt faintly of furniture polish and boiled cabbage, the twin sacraments of respectable lodging-houses. At the end of the corridor she paused before a door. "He was quiet," she said, "very quiet. Always out in the evenings these last weeks. Came back late Tuesday. Looked troubled, if I may say so. Would hardly touch his supper. Did he receive visitors here?" "Never," she replied with some pride. "He kept all his business elsewhere." She departed with a rustle of offended discretion, leaving Purbright and Sergeant Love to enter Catchpole's domain. The room reflected the habits of a man who regarded accommodation as a temporary necessity rather than a field for aesthetic experiment. Everything lay in its allotted place with the almost aggressive neatness of someone who preferred papers to people. A suitcase stood open but orderly under the bed. The wardrobe contained 2 suits, a spare overcoat and a dressing gown that appeared to have been bought for warmth rather than seduction. Love moved to the small writing table by the window. "Looks promising, sir," he observed, with the satisfaction of a man encountering familiar stationery. There, arranged in precise stacks, lay the apparatus of Catchpole's private liturgy, a lined notebook, several manila envelopes, a portable calculator of uncompromising squareness, and a fountain pen positioned exactly perpendicular to the edge. On a chair beside the table sat a battered leather briefcase, unlocked. Purbright opened the notebook. The handwriting was compact and unsentimental, each numeral inscribed with the clarity of one who had spent a career ensuring that figures did not wander from their appointed columns. Headings marched down the pages: St. Jude's Restoration Fund, summary of receipts, expenditure, committee members' personal subscriptions, unreconciled items. Paper clipped inside were photocopies of invoices and receipts. Scaffolding, stone cleaner, specialist tiling, consultancy fees. They had been annotated in red ink with small, lethal comments. "No delivery, checked with contractor. Duplicate billing, dates incompatible. Payment to cash, no corresponding work." Love read aloud with unholy relish. He was not easily charmed, was he? "Bank examiners rarely are," Purbright said. "Their affections do not extend naturally to creative bookkeeping." One envelope contained a draft letter, typed on a portable machine whose uneven characters suggested long service. It was addressed to the Lord Bishop of Barstow, diocesan officers. Purbright read silently, while Love pretended indifference and listened. "My Lord Bishop," it began, "I regret to trouble your lordship with matters of a temporal nature, but recent inquiries into the finances of St. Jude's, Flaxborough, oblige me to report apparent systematic misrepresentation of expenditure." Catchpole then set out, with the unhurried precision of a man unable to resist tidy sequence, the pattern of overstatements and diversions. Approximately £3,000, he concluded, had been allocated to purposes other than those publicly described. The letter concluded, "It is my intention to allow the parish committee the opportunity to correct these irregularities or offer satisfactory explanation. Failing this, I shall feel bound to place my findings in your hands." The last sentence had been crossed through in ink and replaced in smaller script by, "I shall be calling upon the vicar this week and subsequently attending the next committee meeting, when I hope to assist in resolving these matters discreetly." Optimistic of him, Love observed, assuming they would welcome the assistance. Retired men frequently underestimate people's attachment to their little. "Arrangements," Purbright said. "How did our landlady describe him on Tuesday?" "Troubled, sir. Came in late, clutching an envelope." Love opened the briefcase. Inside lay another manila envelope, this one empty, though faint traces of graphite remained in the corners, like the ghost of a spreadsheet departed. There was also a small notebook bearing only dates and times, mostly evenings, each marked SJ or 5th, occasionally both, Visits to St. Jude's, Purbright murmured, and to the vicarage. Tuesday evening shows both. His last earthly itinerary. He moved to the small wardrobe, examining shelves with the unhurried thoroughness that has embarrassed many an amateur criminal and a fair number of professionals. Under a stack of folded shirts, his fingers encountered a flat object, the back cover of a cheap exercise book. Inside, glued to the pages with methodical care, were fragments of bank statements. Each bore the name St. Jude's Restoration Fund account and the logo of the Flaxborough and District Bank. Against several entries, Catchpole had added notes: check to SC, personal AC, round sum withdrawal prior to committee meeting, no corresponding invoice. The initials SC had been circled several times. Next to one instance, in red, cringe, confirm with bank manager. Purbright smiled faintly. Mr. Cringe appears to have loaned parish funds to someone whose initials agree with his own. A coincidence likely to exhaust charitable interpretation. Love, who enjoyed coincidence only when it simplified paperwork, looked at the page with professional gloom. If Catchpole had got as far as showing this lot to the bishop, sir, there'd have been some very red faces in the parish. Faces can recover from coloration, Purbright replied. What they fear is permanent rearrangement. He closed the exercise book thoughtfully. On the bedside table, a small alarm CL. Ox stood beside a dog-eared paperback on investment strategy. The clock had stopped at 5:10, either from mechanical fatigue or previous interference. Catchpole, it seemed, had not relied on it for his final appointment. Anything else of note? He asked. Love bent to check beneath the bed. Just dust, sir. And a stray sock. Not even bank examiners are perfect, Purbright said. As they descended the stairs, Mrs. Vining emerged from the kitchen bearing a tray of cups that appeared to have been polished rather more recently than used. I trust you found everything satisfactory, she asked, with that special deference reserved for policemen and plumbers. Your late lodger, Purbright said, was a very methodical man. Did he ever speak of his work here? Not to me, she replied. He did say once, at breakfast, that some people in Flaxborough were living more comfortably than their means allowed. I told him we all did our best. Did he mention names? Certainly not. Her shock at the suggestion was genuine. One does not discuss local people in a lodging house dining room. It leads to complications. Back on the pavement, Purbright paused, looking thoughtfully at the brass notice on the doorway. The phrase, quiet gentlefolk, floated back to him with unexpected pertinence. Catchpole had come to Flaxborough assuming that quiet meant harmless. He had died abruptly enlightened. Purbright took from his pocket the exercise book with the bank fragments and the notebook of appointments. On the inside cover of the latter, in small, neat script, Catchpole had written a sentence that might have been a private motto or a professional joke. Errors do not occur, they are permitted. Purbright read it twice before slipping the notebook away. The words, he reflected, might apply as easily to morals as to arithmetic. Somewhere between the vicarage, the vestry and the committee table, certain errors had indeed been permitted, by those who now prayed most fervently that they would never be examined as closely as Lionel Catchpole had examined the church accounts. Mrs. Cynthia Blundell received Inspector Purbright in the front drawing-room of Elm House, an address whose very name implied the continued existence of an elm tree somewhere on the premises, though none had been observed in living memory. The room itself, with its regimented chintz and tactfully positioned family silver, gave the impression that everything in it, including conversation, had been arranged long ago and was not to be altered without committee approval. Inspector, she said, extending a hand that managed to be both cordial and proprietorial, I do hope you will allow me to offer tea first. Explanations, I have found, are more easily borne when accompanied by properly made Darjeeling. Purbright accepted because it would have been discourteous not to, and because tea in such surroundings functioned less as refreshment than as a preliminary move in a social skirmish. He took a seat on a sofa that discouraged relaxation through both construction and principle. You wish to discuss Mr. Catchpole, Mrs. Blundell continued, applying herself to the teapot with competent ceremony, and, no doubt, our pitiably humble restoration fund. I thought we might touch on both, Purbright replied. The one appears to have taken a very close interest in the other. Her smile held. Yes, Mr. Catchpole. A tragically nervous man, I always thought, so consumed by figures that he failed to appreciate human frailty. Milk? Thank you, no. She poured with the precision of someone who believed the moral order of the universe could, with sufficient effort, be maintained through correct catering. I have seen some of his notes, Purbright said. Quite thorough. He believed the committee, under your airmanship, had been conducting itself with more enthusiasm than propriety. Enthusiasm, she repeated thoughtfully. An unusual charge to level at a parish committee inspector. Enthusiasm for what he described as cyclical irregularities in the Restoration Fund. Mrs. Blundell set the teapot down with no more force than was strictly necessary. You must understand that church finances do not resemble ordinary commerce. We deal in obligations rather than profits, dignity rather than dividends. To an outsider, particularly a retired bank examiner with nowhere else to apply his anxieties, perfectly legitimate arrangements may appear inventive. His calculations suggested more than £3,000 had been diverted to less than legitimate destinations. Temporary diversions, she corrected pleasantly. Administrative contingencies. The diocese, as you may know, has a way of delaying approvals until opportunities vanish. One must act nimbly or resign oneself to perpetual decay. You will have noticed the roof, Inspector, or rather the absence of it in places. I had understood the absence of the roof was precisely what the Restoration Fund existed to address. And it has, she said quickly, or would have if planning regulations and diocesan guidelines had not conspired against us. Meanwhile, we had urgent needs: carpets, heating, a proper amplification system for Father Makepeace, whose voice, though earnest, does not carry. Expenses which, to a man like Mr. Catchpole, no doubt appeared decadent. And the consulting fees? She looked at him directly then, for the first time abandoning the mild gaze reserved for tradesmen and subcommittees. Inspector, when a parish committee functions only because certain individuals devote hundreds of hours to tedious, unpaid work, it is not unreasonable that modest honoraria be offered. Mr. Cringe, for instance, has spent years wrestling with diocesan returns that would make a less conscientious man take to drink, yet the honoraria did not appear in the accounts under that description, because the diocese frowns upon anything that suggests remuneration. We are all meant to serve out of pure piety, a pleasant ideal but one that sits awkwardly with boiler maintenance and electricity bills. So yes, certain payments were described in ways less likely to invite catechism from the bishop's office. Mr. Catchpole regarded them as embezzlement. Her nostrils flared almost imperceptibly. Mr. Catchpole regarded many things as embezzlement, including, I suspect, gratuities in restaurants. He confronted us with his findings on Tuesday evening. It was all very dramatic in intention, if not in effect. You admit the meeting took place. How could I deny it? He summoned us as though we were minor clerks and he a visiting commissioner. I attended with Mr. Cringe and Miss Hartley. We listened. We examined his numbers. We acknowledged that his interpretation was possible, though hardly generous, and then we agreed to regularize certain entries, to make full restitution of any sums that might, in the most literal sense, be considered improperly allocated. It seemed the simplest way to spare the parish an unseemly quarrel. You were prepared, Purbright said slowly, to repay more than £3,000 at a single meeting. The money, Inspector, had not been squandered at racecourses. It had been used, broadly speaking, for church purposes, albeit through channels that might not satisfy a purist. Reversing those transactions would be inconvenient, not impossible. I have some private means. Mr. Cringe has investments. One tidies up such matters. Purbright turned his cup in its saucer, watching the light catch the thin porcelain. Mr. Catchpole noted in his diary that the committee accepted his accusations with remarkable calm. He found it troubling. That is unfortunate, Mrs. Blundell replied. We were merely relieved that he had not chosen to misinterpret our administrative pragmatism as criminal conspiracy. Had we grown hysterical, I suppose he would have felt more secure. Did he leave your meeting satisfied? He left with the assurance that every penny would be restored and that the bishop would be informed in suitably measured terms. We even asked him to draft the letter if it would give him peace of mind. She paused. He declined, said he would reserve judgment. Purbright allowed a small silence to settle between them. In that pause, the faint tick of the mantel clock, a piece of polished certainty, became audible. You mentioned the bishop, he said. It might interest you to know that he had already been approached by Mrs. Tweed. For the first time, Mrs. Blundell's composure faltered. It was not much, a fractional tightening around the mouth, the smallest displacement of a carefully arranged expression. Dorothea, she said, almost meditatively. Yes, she had become zealous in her later years, a generous donor who had begun to count what she had already given. She wrote to Mr. Catchpole seeking his professional opinion. She also drafted, though did not post, a letter to the bishop detailing what she believed to be systematic abuse of the Restoration Fund. A draft, Mrs. Blundell said quickly, not an action. You cannot hold people responsible for the letters they do not send, Inspector. If you did, half of Flaxborough would be in prison, and the other half under spiritual censure. Someone, Purbright said, felt strongly enough to forge a later letter in her name requesting cremation instead of burial, with great confidence and considerable neatness. That sounds more like Miss Prim's domain than mine, Rs. Blundell replied. Agatha always had a firm hand. On other people's affairs, particularly, she has disappeared. Yes, said Mrs. Blundell. Curious, is it not, how those with the least to lose are often quickest to depart, whereas those of us with reputations and responsibilities must remain to answer questions such as yours. There was no self-pity in the statement, only a flat acknowledgement of social geography. Purbright studied her face, the good grooming, the steady eye, the faint impatience of a woman accustomed to running the parish as one might run a modest but respectable firm. The diocesan auditor arrives next week, he observed. So I am informed. She folded her hands neatly in her lap. We shall present reconciled accounts. Mr. Cringe is working on them as we speak. Everything will be in order to the last penny. The bishop may, if he chooses, tut and sigh. But I assure you, Inspector, there are no great fortunes buried beneath St. Jude's, only small economies and necessary indiscretions. And Mr. Catchpole? Purbright asked. How would you describe his present position in all this? Tragic, she said without hesitation, and most inconvenient. His death casts a melodramatic shadow over what was essentially a bookkeeping quarrel. People will talk, they always prefer narratives, of villainy to explanations of bureaucracy. It is, she paused, choosing with care, unfortunate. Purbright rose. Mrs. Blundell did likewise, with the unhurried grace of someone seeing off an importunate but tolerated caller. At least, she added, as they moved toward the door, you may reassure yourself that whatever errors we have made, they were not of the sordid, common variety. There are no yachts, Inspector, only hymn books and committee minutes. In the hall, while she reached for his coat, his attention shifted to a small side table. Among a neat arrangement of envelopes and notelets lay a checkbook, left open by some domestic oversight. The top check, half obscured by a paperweight, bore a payee he could just discern, St. Jude's Restoration Fund. The amount, however, caught his eye more firmly. £3,247, written in a hand of unhurried assurance. It was dated the previous day. As Mrs. Blundell lifted his coat, she followed his gaze for the briefest instant. Her expression did not change, only her fingers tightened almost imperceptibly on the fabric. Do remember to take an umbrella, Inspector, she said, in her composed committee room voice. In Flaxborough, unpleasant weather has a way of arriving quite suddenly. Father Makepeace had the look of a man who had spent the morning searching for something irretrievably mislaid and had reached the reluctant conclusion that it might be his peace of mind. He telephoned Inspector Purbright at the station with the politeness of one requesting a modest favor, though his tone suggested that the favor might prove doctrinally complicated. If you could spare a few minutes, Inspector, he said. I believe some clarification may be overdue, of a moral rather than strictly legal nature, though I fear the distinction has grown embarrassingly thin. Purbright, who had long suspected as much, agreed to call at the presbytery. St. Jude's vicarage sitting room had the air of having been furnished in cautious installments over 30 years, each purchase approved by a committee formed specifically to consider it. The walls were lined with pious prints which had faded into ecumenical neutrality. Father Makepeace had made tea, presumably as penance. He poured with anxious precision, as if correct proportions might redeem earlier misjudgments. I thought it best you hear certain matters from me directly, he began, not looking at Purbright but at a smile. Reproachful fern on the windowsill. Before they are discovered in forms less flattering to my judgment. Purbright took his cup and sat back, content to allow the silence to arrange itself. I have been, the priest continued, what one might charitably describe as slow to recognize the practical implications of certain spiritual deficiencies within the parish. To speak plainly, I have known more than I have disclosed about our financial irregularities. Known? Purbright repeated, without inflection. Suspected first. Then known, Makepeace admitted. Mrs. Tweed drew my attention to anomalies. She was not subtle, but she was sincere. I regarded her concern as well, a late-onset enthusiasm, harmless if inconvenient. And yet you referred Mr. Catchpole to the committee rather than to the diocese. Makepeace winced. Yes, that decision has been acquiring weight steadily ever since. Mr. Catchpole wrote to me with admirable courtesy, enclosing a preliminary analysis of our accounts. He implied no malpractice. He merely asked whether I was aware that our administrative costs exceeded our visible restoration work by a margin that would embarrass a casual bookmaker. You showed this to Mrs. Blundell? Of course. She was composed. She explained that certain expenditures had been necessary, though not yet rendered visible in stone and mortar. She spoke of diocesan bureaucracy, planning delays, professional consultations. She even referred to short-term internal loans, a phrase I had not encountered in the Gospels, and you believed her. Makepeace hesitated. I preferred to believe her. One grows accustomed to depending upon certain parishioners. Their generosity becomes a structure upon which one leans more heavily than one ought. To doubt their integrity is to undermine the very edifice of parish life. I fear I placed institutional comfort above individual cons. Ian's. You received a further letter from Catchpole, Purbright said. After his meeting with the committee, the priest rose, went to a small writing desk, and unlocked a drawer whose contents seemed to reproach him even before they were revealed. He produced a single envelope and placed it carefully between them, as though setting down a relic of dubious provenance. It arrived the morning they found him in the grave, he said. I opened it before I heard the news. I had not yet learned the correct order in which to experience that particular pair of shocks. Purbright removed the single sheet. Catchpole's hand, neat and unemotional, ran across the page with professional composure that his words only partly supported. Reverend Makepeace, I met with the committee last night. To my surprise, they accepted my findings at once and have agreed to restore all misallocated funds voluntarily. Mrs. Blundell was particularly gracious and assured me that the diocese need not be troubled. On the surface, this seems an ideal outcome, yet I am uneasy. Their readiness to accept responsibility without protest suggests they have some assurance I cannot identify. I must ask plainly, have you given them any guarantee that this matter will not extend beyond parish boundaries? The letter ended there. No conclusion, no signature, only a pen stroke trailing off at the bottom margin, as if interrupted by some more urgent occupation. I had not, Makepeace said quietly. Given such a guarantee, I mean. I had merely hesitated, and their confidence, it seems, filled in the rest. Purbright refolded the paper with the respect due to a document that had already cost its author rather more than postage. You did not, however, reply, no. By the time I might reasonably have done so, Mr. Catchpole was... He glanced instinctively toward the east window, beyond which lay the churchyard. Beyond assurance. He sank back into his chair. His fingers played with the edge of his cassock, a gesture suggestive of someone wishing to adjust his moral garments without quite undressing. There is another matter, he added, with the air of a man reluctantly producing a supplementary sin. Miss Prim came to see me 3 days before Mrs. Tweed's death. She was uneasy, not hysterical, you understand. Hysteria would have been simpler to manage. She said Mrs. Tweed had become reckless in her accusations, that she intended to raise the matter publicly at the next Sunday service if action were not taken. Action of what kind? She wanted me to speak to the bishop, or at least threatened to. I told her such a step required proper documentation. In truth, I dreaded the prospect. Our bishop is a kind man, but ecclesiastical inquiries have a way of lingering, like incense or bad sermons. And Miss Prim's response? She said that if I would not intervene, Mrs. Tweed might feel compelled to do so herself. She used the phrase, she will drag us all into it, whether we are guilty or not. I remember it because at the time I thought her preoccupation was reputational rather than moral. Purbright allowed that to settle. When did you last see Mrs. Tweed alive? 2 days before her death. She attended a weekday communion, which was unusual for her. After the service, she spoke to me in the porch, very calm. She said, Father, if anything should happen to me, you will know where to look. I assumed she referred to the accounts, not to... He stopped, deciding against completing the sentence. You did not inquire further. I suggested she take things slowly. That Christian charity required us to believe the best of others until evidence became incontrovertible. She replied that in her experience, charity often waited until the evidence had been tidied away. Makepeace smiled faintly. Though without humor, I fear she may have been theologically ahead of me. Outside, the distant thud of a spade in the churchyard provided a rhythm to his confession. Jeremiah Pottle, no doubt, correcting some minor geographical misunderstanding among the dead. "Do you consider," Purbright asked, "that your reluctance to act contributed in any way to what followed?" The priest did not answer at once. When he did, his voice had the measured flatness of someone pronouncing sentence on himself in installments. "I think it allowed others more room than they deserved," he said. "Had I insisted on diocesan involvement at the outset, Mrs. Blundell and Mr. Cringe might have been merely embarrassed, not desperate. I provided them with time, Inspector. People can do a great deal with borrowed time." He rose again almost abruptly and crossed to the mantelpiece. A small framed photograph stood there, Mrs. Tweed, in charitable committee attire, presiding over some long-vanished fate. The camera had caught her in mid-disapproval. "There is one further thing," Makepeace said, still looking at the photograph. "I received an anonymous note yesterday. I hesitate to trouble you with it, as it may represent nothing more than mischief. Yet in the present climate, even mischief acquires a certain weight." He produced a slip of paper from his prayer book and handed it to Purbright. The message, composed of letters cut from a parish magazine with commendable neatness, read, "The dead are not where you think." Below, in ordinary ink, someone had added, almost as an afterthought, "Nor the living, either." Purbright studied it for a moment, then looked up. Father Makepeace was watching him with the expression of a man who had at last begun to suspect that his parish contained rather more mysteries than could be resolved by an extra hymn at evensong. The bishop's representative arrived in Flaxborough on a Thursday, which was generally considered an unambitious day for divine intervention. Canon Elric possessed the pale, polished look of a man whose experience of hardship had been confined to diocesan subcommittees. He installed himself in the vestry with a briefcase, a smile of professionally limited warmth, and the serene expectation that the parish would now assist in resolving its own embarrassment. Inspector Purbright, invited to offer any secular insight that might prove pastorally helpful, observed proceedings from a corner chair. He had been accorded the delicate position of honorary inconvenience, too well informed to exclude, too awkward to embrace. Father Makepeace hovered near the door, resembling a curate who had accidentally misplaced a bishop. Canon Elric cleared his throat with liturgical precision. "We are concerned less with apportioning blame," he announced, "than with restoring probity and confidence. The Church can withstand almost anything except public loss of face." Mrs. Blundell, seated very upright at the vestry table, inclined her head as if acknowledging the citation of a well-known doctrine. Mr. Cringe, opposite her, studied a ledger as though it might suddenly offer asylum. Purbright waited. "We have before us," the canon continued, "Mr. Catchpole's notes, the committee's revised accounts, and a cheque which, I am assured, covers all sums whose allocation might be considered imaginative." He rested his hand on the envelope containing Mrs. Blundell's payment. The gesture was almost affectionate, quite imaginative, Purbright remarked. "Particularly in their timing." Mrs. Blundell turned to him with a composure that had endured many seasons of church fetes and diocesan visits. "Inspector, I have never denied that mistakes were made. I merely suggest they were the sort of mistakes that occur when good intentions count." "Inadequate competence. An interesting diagnosis," Purbright said. "Mr. Catchpole preferred fraud. Mrs. Tweed, had she survived her curiosity, might have chosen something stronger." A flinch travelled round the table like a small draught. Father Makepeace found sudden interest in the baptismal register. "The late Mrs. Tweed," Canon Elric said carefully, "is not in a position to contribute to this inquiry." "That," Purbright replied, "is rather the essence of our difficulty." He spoke without heat, but his words settled with a firmness that even ecclesiastical language could not quite cushion. The canon folded his hands. One sensed that the Church, while not prepared to confess, might be willing to compromise. "We must distinguish," Elric said, "between culpable wrongdoing and errors of judgment which have been, shall we say, overtaken by repentance. Restitution has been offered. Certain resignations are contemplated." "Resignations," Purbright observed, "are a convenient form of absolution. One vacates a chair and retains a reputation." Mrs. Blundell's smile thinned. "You would prefer a spectacle, Inspector? Parish officers paraded in handcuffs? I had not taken you for a man of theatrical tastes." "I prefer accuracy," he said. "Mr. Catchpole spent weeks documenting theft. He then placed his findings before you. Instead of protest, you promised full repayment. That is not the behavior of innocent people affronted by slander." It is the practical response of those for whom scandal would be more expensive than restitution. Cringe made a small choking sound. Mrs. Blundell did not look at him. Her gaze remained fixed on Purbright. "Even if I accepted your interpretation," she said, "you would still face a difficulty. Neither you nor anyone else can demonstrate that Mr. Catchpole's death was anything but unfortunate." "Natural causes, I believe Dr. Mallinson said." "Indeed," Purbright replied. "A heart in reasonable order, treacherously assisted, a strong sedative in his tea, administered early enough to ensure collapse before morning. He died quietly, in the graveyard, while the town slept and the parish prepared to bury its other embarrassment." Father Makepeace exhaled audibly. Canon Elric blinked. "You are certain of this?" the canon asked. "The post-mortem left little doubt," Purbright said. "As to the tea, Mrs. Vining recalls that Mr. Catchpole took it only on evenings when he expected late visitors. On Tuesday he declined it until after his meeting at the church. He returned, as she put it, surprisingly content. One might suppose his anxieties had been addressed. He let the observation rest, like a hymn tune everyone knew but preferred not to hum. "You have evidence," Mrs. Blundell said very quietly, "that the tea was tampered with at the church?" "No," Purbright said. "I have evidence that it was not tampered with at Mrs. Vining's. The leaves in her pot were unremarkable. What remained in Mr. Catchpole's cup was more interesting. A sedative, prescribed locally and in some quantity over the years, to parishioners whose public burdens exceed their private resilience." His eyes moved politely to Father Makepeace. The priest colored as if a draught had penetrated his cassock. "The prescription," Purbright continued, "was issued to you, Father, for your nerves." My nerves," Makepeace stammered. Of course the tablets are kept in the vestry cupboard, accessible to any committee member in need of temporary calm." "Quite," said Purbright. "And on Tuesday evening, the vestry hosted both agitation and opportunity in generous measure." Cringe spoke for the first time. "Inspector, you must believe that no one here would contemplate—" "Mr. Cringe," Purbright interrupted gently, "I doubt you contemplated any't. I suspect you trembled, deferred, and signed where told. Other people in this room have shown more initiative." The canon shifted, casting a mildly reproving glance that failed to find a safe target. "These are grave suggestions," he said. "They are grave facts," Purbright replied. "What I lack, Canon, is not a theory but a witness willing to repeat in court what is already scribbled in fear across several consciences." Silence settled again, this time with a density difficult even for theology to explain away. It was Mrs. Blundell who finally broke it. "What precisely do you intend to do, Inspector?" He regarded her with something almost like respect. "That, Mrs. Blundell, depends upon how much of this the Church wishes to manage within its own structures." "She means," Canon Elric translated, "whether you propose to arrest anyone." Purbright considered his hands. "I could charge one or more of you with conspiracy to defraud. I might persuade the Crown to consider a manslaughter count for Mr. Catchpole. As for Mrs. Tweed, well, the difficulty there is more medical than legal. Sedatives again, administered to an elderly woman with a precarious heart. Excessive kindness, one might call it." No one moved. "However," he went on, "I am, perhaps unwisely, susceptible to institutional embarrassment. Public trials produce headlines. Headline writers are not charitable." Canon Elric's shoulders relaxed by a measurable fraction. "You would be prepared to moderate the civil consequences?" "I am prepared," Purbright said, "to acknowledge that some of what has occurred may be addressed, more swiftly by ecclesiastical means. Provided that the addressing is genuine, not decorative." Mrs. Blundell's eyes narrowed very slightly. Negotiation, one felt, was familiar ground. "What would genuine look like, in your opinion?" "Full restitution has already been offered, Purbright. It will be accepted, of course, but under no illusion that it cancels the past. You," he looked at her, "will resign all offices at St. Jude's and elsewhere. No more committees, no more funds. Mr. Cringe will likewise withdraw from any position involving accounts. The diocese will appoint an external treasurer and conduct an audit that leaves no corner of this parish's finances unexplored." "And the matter of Mr. Catchpole?" Canon Elric asked. Purbright's reply came without ornament. "The inquest will record death as misadventure, with certain observations about the unwise combination of sedatives and exertion. I shall ensure those observations find their way into appropriate files, though not onto front pages." "And Mrs. Tweed?" Father Makepeace asked, barely audible. "Her death," Purbright said, "will remain officially natural. Unnatural naturalness is not, alas, rare among the elderly. But internally, his gaze shifted to Elric. The church might quietly review the circumstances. A memorandum, perhaps, on the hazards of discussing finances with inconvenient benefactors while in possession of very powerful pills. Canon Elric inclined his head, accepting the rebuke as one more unwelcome item on his administrative list. "And you ask nothing else?" "I ask," Purbright said, "that at some point, perhaps during a retreat or other edifying occasion, one of you reflect on why it proved easier to still two awkward voices than to abandon a profitable arrangement." No answer was offered. It was not the sort of question that invited spoken reply. The meeting dissolved with the slow, slightly confused movements of people whose positions had shifted beneath them without producing the dramatic collapse they had half expected. Mrs. Blundell left first, walking with habitual dignity, though her hands trembled fractionally when she adjusted her gloves. Mr. Cringe followed. Carr, wrying his ledger with the air of a man escorting contraband to its final, deserved obscurity. Canon Elric remained a moment with Father Makepeace, engaged in a low-voiced conversation about guidance, healing, and the constructive uses of shame. Purbright stepped out into the churchyard, where the late afternoon light lay across the stones with mild disapproval. The grave intended for Mrs. Tweed, but briefly occupied by Mr. Catchpole, had been filled and turfed with municipal competence. It looked entirely ordinary now, which was, he reflected, a sort of lie. As he turned to leave, something caught his eye. A fresh notice pinned to the lich gate, printed in the vicarage typewriter's faint, uneven script, St. Jude's Restoration Fund. Temporary suspension of appeal. Further announcements to follow. At the bottom, in Father Makepeace's careful hand, a line had been added in ink. "We regret any distress previously caused." Purbright stood a moment, reading the words. He wondered, without particular urgency but with a mild, persistent curiosity, whether the regret referred to the misuse of money, the silencing of protest, or merely the trouble of having been found out.